I made a completely reversible top using our popular Antero Shell sewing pattern. All the seams are concealed and I quilted the layers together using these wavy stitches. I also finished the hemline with binding. I'm going to show you how I did it. You don't need the facing pattern pieces, just cut a front and the back in each layer. I'm using this nice flannel as well as a striped linen. And the first sewing step you're gonna do is stitch all of your shoulder seams together. So I pinned them right sides together and headed to my machine to stitch them at 1/2 inch. I then pressed my shoulder seam allowances open, all 4 of my seams, and laid my tops right side up and then right side down, matching up those shoulder seams. We're going to pin around the neckline, and I also marked the seam allowance right at that front V, so when I stitched them together, I really knew where that point was so I could do a nice pivot. Then once that was sewn, I trimmed and graded my seam allowance. I clipped right into that V, trimmed it to 1/2 the width, and then clipped into the back curve as well. To get a nice crisp finish, I actually like to press these seam allowances open first. You get a really nice neckline shape. Do lots of pressing for this. I'm gonna top stitch my neckline later, but now we're gonna do the fun part. Using the burrito method, we're gonna roll in one side edge so we can actually pin the other side right sides together over that rolled top. We're gonna match up the shoulder seams and stitch in between the notches right sides together. Make sure to back stitch well at the notches too. Then we're gonna pull the top out through the tunnel and repeat for the other side. Roll it up, and then you're able to pin the other side, right sides together, again, stitching in between those notches. In order to press these seam allowances open, I actually like to use a sleeve roll and insert it in the top to press it open. Then flip your entire top to the right side and we are going to stitch the side seams together. So just take one layer. For example, I'm using my striped layer here and we are going to pin the side seams. You're going to start at the hem and then work your way up to that notch. And you are going to start stitching exactly where that stitching ended for that armhole seam. So really make sure your layers are shifted out of the way, put your needle in, and then stitch down. I did an extra step here and I also had to do some stripe matching, but I love the way it turned out. Now we need to stitch the other layer's side seams together, and I did this in the exact same way I did the first. I shift all the allowances out away from the seam and I use a pin to hold the bulk, and then stitch from the notch down to the hem. I like to double check on both layers of the fabric to make sure I'm not catching anything, and I'm starting right where that first stitching line ended. Now press your side seam allowances open. And at this step of the process, and while I'm already at my ironing board, I like to give the shell one good press before I start quilting. So I put my top wrong sides together, repress that neckline, the armholes, and made sure the hems were aligned. I'm using pins right over my side seams because I'm actually going to be stitching in the ditch to hold them together. And while I'm at my machine, I'm going to top stitch around my neckline and armhole edges. I use my hands to separate the seams so I can get right in there. And then for my top stitching, I'm only stitching about 1/8 inch away from the edge. For my armhole, I'm making sure to pivot around those bottom notches. Here's how my top stitching looks, and I'm so excited to move on to the next step. I pinned my hemline together, and you can plan your quilting. You can do straight line quilting, free motion, or wavy stitches. I like the wavy stitches because they're more forgiving, and here I did it in this pieced example too, just for some more inspiration. I switched to a walking foot on my machine because it moves the layers a bit better. I start at one hemline near the side seam and then work my way up the top, passing over the shoulder seam and then down the other side of the top. When I reach the hem, I pivot, do a couple stitches, and repeat. I do several rows of wavy stitches in from each side seam, leaving the front and back to fill in after. You can see how they pass over the shoulder seam so nice. Then to finish my centers, I start at the hem, and since I can't pass over the shoulder seam, I pivot and stitch along my top stitching and then go down the other side. But first I need to double check my bobbin because I've been doing a lot of sewing, and good thing I did because I was running low. So back to quilting. And to make this nice and seamless, I stitch exactly over my existing top stitching for my neckline. This makes it really nice and tidy. Now my quilting's done and I love the way it looks, and the last step is to finish it with binding. So I cut 2 strips that are 2.5 inches wide, and I'm just gonna trim them to be 1/2 inch larger than the top, and I'm gonna stitch those together along the side seams. Then I press those allowances open and then press my binding in half widthwise. Then I fold in each edge to that center. Now to pin the binding to the top, I open my binding and pin it matching up the side seams. And I'm gonna stitch it exactly in that first crease. Then working from the other side, I'm gonna wrap it around the allowance and put in perpendicular pins to my binding. This really helps it hold in place while I do my top stitching to make sure I'm catching it from the other side. This top was a blast to make and even more fun to wear. I can wear it this striped way or flip it over for my flannel way. And I also loved this pieced version that I made for McCall's Quilting. Shop the pattern and more at sewdaily.com.